We continue Good Vibrations, a Beach Boys program with David Beard, the editor-in-chief of Endless Summer Quarterly, ESQ for short, the guy in the striped shirt. Insert your adjectives as you wish. I'm Ron Vaccaro, and we are diving right into part 2 of the Brian Wilson Productions installments of Endless Summer Quarterly. This is the spring 2025 part 2. And David, I want to start just, pictures are representative of words and themes. And, the image on the cover of Brian from part 1 to part 2 is notably different. Is that symbolic, whimsy, something of all of the above? How'd you pick this specific photo of Brian for this cover?
I'm just realizing you asked me in part 2 of our program about part 1 of the issue. You asked me how I did the covers, and I never really fully got around to answering that.
I know, so we could get into.
We'll talk about that now. Once I realized what I wanted to do, and then once I had the content from all the different interviews that I'd done, I thought, oh gosh, this is going to take up more than one issue. The first thought I had was, well, I'm keeping these kind of in chronological order, based on act, so that it's 62, then 63, then 64, then 65. And I thought, well, what I want to do then is I want to show who's kind of inside, and I do that across the bottom of and the names at the bottom are the same for these 2 editions. And then I thought, well, I want the first cover to be a younger Brian, 62, 63-ish. And then I want the second issue to be kind of at least a 64, 65 timeline, because it goes up to Glenn Campbell and for Guess I'm Dumb. And I thought, well, that's 65. So I just spent hours looking at images from 64 and 65. And I had, 3 or 4 different ones that I whittled it down to. And it was just something about the one that I chose from the party sessions of him holding the 3 harmonicas. I just liked the way it fit with the records around him. That was one of the criteria. There was lots of interesting photos to choose from, but one of the things was I want an image of Brian where I can do things around him, to where it is easy enough to see. And so that was kind of one of the criterias, and that ended up being the photo that I liked. And as we go through the year 2025, Brian will continue to get older. So that's kind of the trick, now, except for the summer edition, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The summer edition is going to be a neat little kind of a side standalone thing, and then we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Well, you know how to do a tease. So you talk about that time transition and getting older, and I think between part 1 and part 2, and even the years you just mentioned, to me there's change happening, there's evolution happening, revolution in some cases happening in a few different dimensions. There's Brian's personal growth, development, changes. There's the country's changes. I mean, early 60s, mid 60s, late 60s. You want to talk about radical difference, my gosh. So those seeds are firmly taking on by the time you get to certainly post the fall of 63, 64, 65. And then you get the musical changes that are happening. And it's like, I think you get kind of some of it overt, some of it more subtle, but just you kind of really get, a confluence of all those things that when you dive into a topic like this.
So true. It was Gary Griffin who told me, and I'm only paraphrasing, but we were talking about, he was showing me his 45 collection. He had some Beatles 45s with picture sleeves and some Beach Boys and other acts, and I don't remember everything, but he was showing them to me. And it wasn't a big collection. It's not some like a memorabilia, like my mess. But it was just, and he started talking about, he said, man, you was so interesting when I was growing up in the early 60s, because you knew every day that you woke up, this is so cool, you knew every day that you woke up and you turned on the radio, you would hear something new from the day before. That's how great music was in that period, and how much was coming from the different acts. And not everybody put out 12 albums in 4 years like the Beach Boys did, but the Beatles were on a fairly aggressive musical output pace too, as were many other artists of their time. You know, any act coming out of Motown, you know, and as you note, by 64, 65, you have a whole new series of types of groups coming in. 64 marks kind of the beginning of the British invasion. You've got a whole slew of new musical acts coming in onto the AM radio. It's a very different time. And then by 65, 66, you're suddenly looking at certainly 66, 67, a drug culture and drugs finding their way into music, psychedelic music becoming a thing, and long format recordings. You know, Anagata Vita, MacArthur Park. These songs are longer and intentionally so. And so then, you know, by the time you get to the late 60s, FM radio is beginning to take hold because they're playing the whole albums by the artists on the radio, like as we're going to experience this together. There's a lot of great music that came out of 66, I think was the first Doors album. So there was a lot of great, interesting music just coming out. As Gary Griffin said, every day you wake up, you turn down the radio, you heard something new and more progressive than the day before. And that just, if you go back and look at the charts, I mean, it would be hard-pressed not to know a single that was in the top 20. If you just looked at the charts and didn't even pay that much attention to music, you could see the artist, and you may not know the artist, but if you see the song title, you'd probably likely know, oh yeah, I know that. So yeah.
What's your biggest takeaway from the interview you did with the Honeys?
Probably the protectiveness. I wasn't surprised by it, but how they are still loyally and lovingly protective of Brian. And that is the thing that stands out to me, and you know, and that he made the transition.
Even Murray, even there was. Yeah. I mean, I was surprised by that.
Yeah, so they you know, it's interesting because for those who might not know, the Honeys were originally they were called the Ravel Sisters because they were Diane, Marilyn, and their sister Barbara, and they just. It seems to me they had a record released, and I'd misremember it if I tried to remember the title. But then Ginger Blake, their cousin, sound familiar, comes in and joins, and she's dating Gary Usher, by the way. Ginger and Gary Usher go see the Beach Boys in 62 when their residency is at Pandora's Box. Ginger then goes and tells her cousin, you got to come to Pandora's Box to see these guys play, and that's how Brian and spills the hot chocolate on Marilyn's blouse, as the story goes, and that's how they meet. And it's interesting. The one thing that surprised me was I just assumed, and I don't know where this might have popped up to correct me anywhere else, but I always just kind of got it in my brain that Brian and Marilyn met and they started dating. And Marilyn corrected that and said, we didn't really date. We just started spending time together. And he would always come over to my parents' house, and one could understand that. If Brian wanted a home, the timeline's not. That's one of the things with these. So that's one of the questions. Is I don't know exactly when Brian moved from his house to Crenshaw Boulevard, and I don't know exactly when Brian moved from Crenshaw Boulevard to 108th Street. But we know from the first edition with my interview with Victoria that he left a hand-drawn note, said, I've moved. They, you know, I don't have a phone anymore, but I've moved. I just wanted to, okay. So and so if you want this, you're going to have to get the thing. But Brian left a handwritten note on Victoria's, under her windshield wiper.
So like 108th Street, right?
Yeah, and it was a map that he drew himself. Sold to the boy in the Grand Prix is what he wrote on the map. See, because he had just bought in a Grand Prix. And Dave Nolan talks all about that because he was with Brian giving the car dealer some shit over the phone when he was ordering the car. So that I thought all tied together beautifully. So I liked that I was getting these two different things about Brian and his Grand Prix from two different sources. And I loved that because I wasn't asking either about the Grand Prix, but they both brought that into the conversation, and I love that. So with the Honeys, I like that even though Brian, again, here he's got another recording act, 63 going into 64, and we're going to talk about Sharon Marie in a minute, and that's very pivotal. And he's recording now, but he's got a group. He's got 3 female singers that he can sing with, and they both tell me, and this has been said for years, that they considered Brian liked being in the Honeys more than he did the Beach Boys, and I could see that to what we were talking about, him being embarrassed by the falsetto. Well, he wouldn't be embarrassed by the falsetto if he's singing with girls, because he could pocket his voice in with theirs without it being a distinctive thing, and not be embarrassed because he could sound that way. So I would liken that as one reason, and the other thing was that he didn't have the same pressure. But again, they did not have the chart success. Would he have been a Honey full time? Would he have made that decision? Again, Brian and the Honeys, I don't know, because it just didn't work out that way. And I guess we're going to segue into Sharon Marie, because I think that's one of the most pivotal parts of this whole story. Is you have I only teased this 2-page letter from Brian that he wrote to Sharon Marie, which basically outlines that he and his father Murray are producing her as an act. That the two of them as a team, Brian and Murray as a production team, are producing Sharon, which was news to me. I've not seen that anywhere else. And I print the full letter in the VIP PDF, along with 8 pages of letters from Mike that people have never seen before. So it's where Mike is writing Sharon, telling her about how he is her manager. So Brian and Mike are writing the songs for Sharon Marie, Runaround Lover, and of note, the B-side to Runaround Lover is George Gershwin's Summertime. That's noteworthy, because Brian was heavily influenced by Gershwin, because he said it many times, like when he was a little, like 2-year-old or 4-year-old, whatever the age was, I think it was 2, where he was at his grandparents' house and they had Gershwin records and they were playing and he heard Gershwin, and that affected him. But this is a point in Brian's life where he's being more and more informed. And I love that. That's the word that came to me with this exploration, because he would try this over here. I'm going to do this with my friend Bob Norberg and his buddies, the Survivors. Let's see what works out here. And the agreement was that Rich Ilarion, one of the Survivors, helped Brian with a couple of songs. We don't know what those songs are, but the handshake deal or the like-minded agreement was then Brian would write a song for the Survivors and get them a single release through Capitol. And Capitol turned down Witchstand, and then the rest of the story is in the part 1. It's in here. You got to get the magazine. So Brian was constantly, that stands out to me, as Brian was constantly trying things, not just from the perspective of, okay, I've got a 2-track recorder, now I've got a 4-track recorder, what can I get away with, how can I do it? I think he did more of that pure, intentional exploration in terms of what can I get away with a 4-track, now that I've got 4 tracks to work with the Beach Boys. That to me was where he, but until, say, All Summer Long and the Christmas album, again, June, July of 64, until that point, I think he was open to the idea of still doing other acts. But I think they became so successful at that point because of the Shutdown Volume 2 album that had Don't Worry Baby, Fun, 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 and The Warmth of the Sun, just to name a few songs. That to me was where I think it became clear that the success that he had generated with the Beach Boys was something that was going to control his time and his energy. But even up until June of '64 is when Sharon's second single comes out, Thinking About You Baby. That's right during, well, they're doing all summer long. So then you have I Get Around, and you have more success. You have Wendy, you have When I Grow Up to Be a Man. It's all of a sudden, these songs are really coming together, and they're getting better and better and better, and they're sounding better and better and better. And the songs are reaching more people, and there's more and greater chart success with these recordings. And it wouldn't make sense for Brian to continue to distract himself with outside acts, because the machine was going down the hill at full steam, or coming around the tracks at full steam. It got to a point where the idea that he would even toy with an outside act would seem fruitless, because he wasn't having, I believe that if he had had to chart success, he would have continued to do it. But there's enough that we see in parts 1 and part 2 in these interviews with these figures where the other guys weren't all that taken with the idea that Brian was taking his time and energy away from them.
You were just talking about it, this time period. But you go from, and it's all in this interview, these interviews. You go from Memorial Day in wine country, California, up in the Russian River Valley, right? And some, a momentous concert there where meetings take place. And you go the following year, you up to June of '64, and it's like, among the things you learn in that time period, keeping our General Motors Cars theme going, you find out how they got four people in a powder blue Corvette, and what that seating arrangement was. And David Marks has a role, and Dennis, and it just, to your point, and I think that's one of the things, like the Q&A style lends itself. You drive the narrative, but you get all these gems that just, you didn't ask about that, but it's like, oh my God, like the stories that just, sometimes you got to find yourself going back and rereading something for the other details that are in there as a tangential part of the question that was asked. But I think you really, you talk about, we were talking earlier about Brian being, singing with the girls in the false, it's like, and then, part of this too is, well, no, there's not going to be a girl in the Beach Boys. Murray's like, it's the Beach Boys. And, well, that's part of this too.
That's it. It very much is. It's very interesting to me that with Sharon Marie, they did a photo shoot with her in the fall of '63. And I can only imagine the photo shoot was what it was because Murray told his boys they all needed to be there. That's the best I can figure out. It's a clear publicity promotional shoot that was conducted with Sharon Marie, Mike, Brian, and I think a lot of people have seen these photos. I put some select ones in, but Mike, Brian, and Carl Engman of Capitol Records are posed with Sharon Marie, like holding a single between them. It's probably not really her single, which is why it's cleverly covered up. But it's clear to me they had specific intentions and ideas about what they were going to do with Sharon Marie, and she was going to be a Brian and Mike recording act. There is no doubt in my mind at all, based on the letters that I have that they wrote to her, based on those publicity stills that were taken, the fact that they were taken at all. Now, Brian, Dennis, and Carl are there as well, and show up in some of the photos. What's unique is this is just after David Marks had left and Al was in the process of joining, and neither one of them is there. So again, another question comes from this: why is the other Beach Boy not there? And I think the answer to that, in that moment, at that specific time, Murray was toying with the idea of a girl and the Beach Boys, or whatever that was going to be, whatever model they were thinking about, whatever, because we have all this history and we're always looking backwards, regardless of what point we came into their history, and we're looking back. We weren't there in the moment, and what I know beyond a shadow of a doubt with these two editions, especially in part one, is that Brian was trying to figure out who he was. He was trying to figure out, am I a Beach Boy? Am I a producer? Am I just a songwriter? Am I an arranger? He was trying to find his place in the music industry. And he wasn't, oh, I'm the lead Beach Boy, I'm this, and I'm a songwriter, and he knew that he was writing songs, and he knew that he was coming up with arrangements and compositions, but he did not know what, if he was taking a coin and putting it on his thumb and tossing it in, if you're at a fairgrounds and you're trying to win the big stuffed teddy bear and you got to make the coin land on the top dish. He didn't know where the coin was going to land. He just had no idea. And he knew he was onto something, which is why he never stepped away from music. He just stayed with it. He had a roommate in Bob Norberg and the guy who moved in next door was Dave Nolan. So they had this musical environment, and he was never away from music. And the whole point of him moving into the house on 108th Street was that it was a bigger space for them to put their equipment, because they didn't have any furniture, barely. They had like a couch and either sleeping bags or mattresses on floors, and possibly a table to eat off of. It was really a place for them to come up with musical ideas and jam and record. And that's what those places served as. It was a base for him to come up with music. So he was not there, even though the Beach Boys had signed a contract. I don't at any point think that Brian knew, especially based on what was said to me in these interviews, that Brian had any construct of an idea of how successful they would be between 62 and 60. I don't think anybody had any idea. You don't know you're going to write I Get Around until you write I Get Around. You don't know that you're going to write Don't Worry Baby until you write Don't Worry Baby. So no one knew in 62, 63, before those songs were written, what was going to happen. And then how incredible they would be and how much they would change everything. Everything kind of it's interesting to me, one, how much we take the littlest tiny thing and we kind of get really focused, like Brian's love of R&B. We're really focused on it. But it's important in the grand scheme. So that's why I don't mind giving that much attention to something that small in terms of the overall conversation. But that's the other thing I think it's very important for people to understand who are fans of Brian and his music. And that is, he did not know at the stage of 62 going into 63, or really most of 63, even though he was producing other acts and Trini had a hit with Surf City, he knew music was his bag, and that he was going to stick to it. He did not know and had no type of foresight that he was going to do what he would go on to do. And I think that's why he kept working with outside acts, because he just didn't know. And I think working with outside acts really served him and informed him well, because it helped him get more. If you're working with a female artist, you might hear something and recognize something that you normally wouldn't hear just working with other male voices. So I think that everything served him well. All the work he did, whether it charted or not, I don't think, for me personally, doesn't matter. I think everything informed him and helped him.
To me, I'm really glad you said that, because it gets to the fact that there's art and science involved in almost everything in life, and certainly music. It's not just one or the other, because you talk about the involvement, like some of these interviews talk about the jealousy factor of, hey, Carl might not have liked this. He thought it should have been a full-time job. This stuff comes up. Who the hell am I to argue with that perspective? But to the point you just made, you can say, well, okay, like if you're talking about this is a full-time job, well, sure. but the ceiling of what you can do when you're working on anything is going to get higher as the horizons expand from this other stuff. And so to me, you really, I mean, that's one of the takeaways I see from there. And it's really, I'm glad you just said it the way you did, because it's like, the benefit of hindsight, right? Before we leave Sharon Marie totally, I want to go to 2013, 2014 after spending so much time in 63, 64, because I thought your conversation about what happened and reconnecting in 2013 and 14 time period was poignant and impactful, because this is all ultimately about people, and it's on a human level, and we're learning more and more about these human stories. So I don't know, but just that really struck me.
Yeah. Now, again, most of that, a lot of the Sharon Marie interview
It was Andrew Doe in
was Andrew Doe.
15, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And that was back. So the 2013, 2014 was kind of an addendum because the
Yeah.
first one was 2010, 2011. And it was interesting to have Sharon talk about visiting and seeing Brian and Mike and saying, "Hey, it's me, Sharon." After all that time, it's kind of like the Dave Nolan thing to a degree, but not quite the same. I think Dave kind of just Dave really hit it out of the park for me, with just the whole. I'm going over to see my friend Brian, not because he's Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys or that he worked on a recording with me, but he's my friend and I love him, and I'm going to go over and see him and tell him so, and have some, just shoot the shit with him and see how he is. And that's what friendships are all about.
Glenn Campbell. What impresses you the most about that conversation? From, and you talk about going back, like that was, I think, from the early
2003.
2000s, early 2000, yeah, 2003.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that when I went back and got that interview, because I've watched the documentary. I don't know if you have or anyone else has. That I'll be me. I'll be me. I think is the name of the Glenn Campbell documentary. Where it shows where he's the Alzheimer's coming in. This is before he passed away, and he's touring, and he knows the songs better than he can remember stuff. Which reminds me a lot of Jan Berry after his accident. He could sing better than he could talk. It just made me melancholy a little bit because Glenn Campbell was such a force. And I loved his comments. I was glad to revisit it and include it here in part 2 because I just thought it was really, guess I'm dumb. And it was just such a unique tie-in because just last year we had the release of the Duets album where Brian appeared on the song Strong, where Brian's band came in and put in all those neat little nods to Guess I'm Dumb. And I just thought, wow, how, again, just what are the chances that I'm pulling this back up just after this just happened? And I think it lent itself to me wanting to do it because I had already started on the journey of doing this idea with these production editions. And that album came out and I went, oh gosh, that's right. I have Guess I'm Dumb. And so Glenn doesn't talk about it much, but the thing I was reminded of is how he just broke into song. Mike Love will do that too. He'll just start singing something. And Brian's done that once with me. Al's done it. It's interesting how they all will kind of do it. But Glenn just, we're talking about Guess I'm Dumb, and all of a sudden he goes, the way I act don't seem like me. I'm just like, wow, dude is crooning to me over the phone. And he was great. It was a short conversation. It wasn't all that long, but it was just nice to have, because Glenn has got such a distinct and unique history with the group. Because he toured as a Beach Boy for a number of months, the end of 64, going into 65, and then was gone. He went on to become Glenn Campbell, and months after leaving the Beach Boys touring unit, he releases Guess I'm Dumb, which is, for all intents and purposes, a Brian Wilson solo single. It is. I mean,
scratch track and everything, right? We talk about the perfectionism that comes up and just the labor of love that went into that Glenn is giving, while brief, specificity to is striking. It tells you a lot.
yeah, that song, "Guess I'm Dumb," is as good of a Brian Wilson song from that era as good as anything that came from Brian. I mean, it is right there with. I mean, if I would have loved for them to, like, when Pet Sounds came out, if they would have taken like a Brian version of "Guess I'm Dumb" and did it with "I Just Wasn't Made for These Times" as a single, that just would have knocked. Of course, I was only one at the time, but that would knock my socks off now if I could look back and there would be such a thing. But yeah, Brian has said, and I think Glenn also has said, that Mike just wasn't hip to the lyric of saying "Guess I'm dumb," and it's like, I guess to a degree, almost like saying I'm a square with that timeline of that period. And it just, for a group, for a musical group that their whole selling point was we're hip and we're cool. Doesn't matter what we're singing about, but we're hip and we're cool. I mean, that's who the Beach Boys were. They were a hip, cool surfing group, right? Pop surfing group. It didn't matter what they were singing about. They were the Beach Boys. And it could be, wouldn't it be nice? But it wasn't. And I know I could simplify this by saying Mike didn't think it would reach the correct target audience. And I don't know what was said, but that would be a fair thing to say, because that would probably be true. If Brian released it as a solo single, who knows? But I mean, he did that with Caroline No on March 7th of '66. And all the guys were supportive of Caroline No because they made the little radio jingles for it. Mike, Bruce, and Carl were there for that. And so there wasn't animosity. So that's what I want to say. Just because Mike says to Brian, I don't want us putting out a song that says "Guess I'm Dumb." I don't want to make that a Beach Boys record. That's not saying to Brian, and if Mike put Brian down about it, it would have been a cousin to cousin jab type of thing. It wouldn't have been a hurtful, like, what the fuck are you thinking type of deal. It's not like that. I think people really get that confused. Mike was vehemently against drug use, but he was smoking pot around the time that everybody else started smoking pot. It took him a little bit to kind of decide what he was going to do. Once he saw enough stuff where Brian was, getting a little crazy from the acid trips, he decided, well, maybe I should cool it because I don't like what I'm seeing. And Al Jardine has said he didn't like what he was seeing, where Brian drove him around in a parking lot in circles and said, "Yeah, I'm done. You're tripping on acid. You got to try it." And I was like, well, maybe not.
Yeah.
And Al has said publicly that when it came to the song "Hang On to Your Ego," and Brian has said this because it's in my interviews with the guys, that they all thought Mike's suggestion and changes to the lyrics to make it "I Know There's an Answer" were appropriate. Brian hasn't said, no, I wasn't for what Mike was suggesting. I didn't agree with it. There's none of that. "Hang On to Your Ego" is a great track to listen to, and I love it in its original form. And I love that Brian in 1966 was writing about tripping on acid. But there's no right or wrong to it. I'm glad it happened the way that it did with "Guess I'm Dumb" and "Hang On to Your Ego," because Brian's creativity, the only way he finds his way to those notes or the structure of those songs or those chord progressions is to be allowed to be creative. And the fact that "Guess I'm Dumb" exists the way that it does, and that "Hang On to Your Ego" is out there in the Sessions box set, is because Brian had creative reign. And so I love that "Guess I'm Dumb" exists, and I love that it's on the Glenn Campbell. Look it up, people. It's worth listening to. The song is called "Strong." It's from Glenn Campbell's "Ghost on the Canvas," the duet sessions, and it was just released, I believe, at some point in 2023. So it's been out over a year. But Brian's on the song "Strong." I think there's a lyric video, but listen to "Guess I'm Dumb" first, and then listen to "Strong," both on YouTube, and you'll hear it. You'll hear all the beautiful little nods that Brian's band, Darian Sahanaja, and I think Probin Gregory, and I don't know who else right off the top of my head, but they put in these wonderful nods to Guess I'm Dumb in there, and it's worth every moment.
Well, that covers two parts of Brian Wilson Productions. What's around the bend?
So I wanted to, in the first part, I did just the sidebar for the first thing that I'm aware of that Brian did, which was with Gary Usher. And I thought, man, I just wish Gary Usher were still here. Because they would work a number of times, very much early days, but then again in the mid 80s, leading up to Brian's solo album in 88. Usher worked on Let's Go to Heaven in My Car. They worked on quite a number of recordings together. And then Landy came along and booted Usher out of the picture. But Gary Usher's an interesting writer. He's an interesting songwriter. And I wanted to do something that represented Brian and Gary's collaboration. So that's the direction of the summer edition. The summer edition is going to be like a one issue, still Brian Wilson Productions, but kind of a one issue stop off, focusing on Brian and Gary Usher with work done. It's almost like a Stephen J. McParland book. Now, if anyone doesn't know who Stephen J. McParland is, he's an Australian guy, a great Beach Boys historian. And if you go to CM Music, if you just type in Stephen, which is STEPHEN J, and then McParland, capital M small c PARLAND, and it should take you to a PDF site of his where all these books are free. And there's actually an ad that I put in both editions.
For Bruce.
For the Bruce book and for the Gary Usher book is in that. And because I want to drive people to Stephen's work. Stephen's work is just like everything else, though. It's like opening the door to get a lot of information, to get a lot of insight and questions answered. But then there's also looming questions because the people aren't here anymore, or with Brian, he's not doing interviews anymore. And if he did, I don't know what he would remember. We're asking. It's interesting that the guys remember anything at all, because none of them, just like we were touching on earlier, none of them at any point was thinking when they're recording I Get Around, oh gosh, I'll be talking about this 60 plus years from now. It's not in the brain. The brain doesn't think that way. When they have Good Vibrations come out, they're not thinking, oh, I'll be answering questions about Good Vibrations on its 50th anniversary in 2016. That's not a thought. Now, by 88 with Kokomo, maybe there was a thought there with, I wonder what I can do with this. I wonder if I can make drinks with this later. Okay, maybe. But because by that time, Mike's brain was in full gear in terms of marketing madness. But with the early work and them just finding their way and creating new music, no, I just think. So summer will be kind of a Gary Usher centric edition with Stephen's work, because I really felt it was important for people to kind of have access to it. It'll be kind of an abridged thing of what Stephen's books are, and I want to drive traffic to Stephen's books. And then the fall, I have interviews. I have Fred Vail content, but I think I'm going to try to talk to him because he's got, it's my understanding that the Cows on the Pasture project will come out in the third or fourth quarter of this year. That's great timing. I have an interview already done with David Sandler. David Sandler is the gentleman that Brian brought in 71, 72 to produce the Spring album, which was Brian's wife at the time, Marilyn, and her sister, Diane. So I have an interview done with him, completed. And then I'm going to probably I have something from Stevie Kalinich, but I'm probably going to talk to him again about this record. Oh, I got a magazine in front of it. This record, which is A World of Peace Must Come. And this is from 69, and this is another project similar to Cows in the Pasture, where Brian initially was interested, and he worked on a couple of tracks, and then he just stopped. So this is 69, Cows in the Pasture is 70, and then Spring is 72. So I have Now I'm going to, and of course, as you might imagine, Brian will be older on the cover. So that's
Right.
that's kind of what. Yeah. So I knew with this first edition of ESQ about Brian's Productions that I wanted to do a full year of Brian on the cover. That was something that I knew that I wanted to do. And as the year went on, with the exception of the Gary Usher, and I might be able to find if I can get a 66, 67 Brian and Gary, that would be fantastic, because that would be ideal, because then I can keep the Brian getting older train going. So that's what I'm going to probably shoot for. But by the time the year is out, there's something exciting at the end of it all. So that's just, and it's not cows in the pasture. There's something exciting at the end of it all. So I just hope, looking back, once it's all done after 2025 is up, that we have something really cool and special.
Well, we will look forward to talking to you about those installments and asking you about how you chose which older picture to go with. And as our conversations continue, we thank all of you for coming along for the ride with us. And more to come, and keep on staying tuned. It's a pleasure always to talk to you on Good Vibrations, a Beach Boys program.
See you soon.